There continue to be numerous calls in this country for the federal government to intervene in the extradition case against Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou. Those calls started last week, in particular from 19 prominent Canadians who wrote a letter to the Prime Minister asking that the Justice Minister intervene in the case right now and put an end to it in order to try and secure the release of two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who have been detained in China for more than 560 days. One of the first people to call for a so-called prisoner swap was former Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister John Manley. I spoke to him a bit earlier about both NAFTA 2.0 and that coming into effect on Canada Day, but also this subject, the relationship between Canada and China. Here's what he had to say. I want to switch gears and get you on another topic before I let you go, because it was a question from my colleague David Aiken last week that I first piqued my interest, and I definitely wanted to talk to you about it because it kind of kicked off an entire week of discussions around what Canada should do about Meng Wanzhou, Huawei's CFO, who, of course, is detained here in Canada, and the two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who are detained in China now for more than 560 days. You had written, I think it was on Bennett Jones, like a blog post, and then given an interview way back when, I think December and January, about the idea of a prisoner exchange. And my colleague David Aiken brought that up to the Prime Minister. And I just want to read to you what the Prime Minister said and get your reaction. He rejected that idea and said in response to the question that anyone who is, quote, considering weakening our values or weakening the independence of our justice system doesn't understand the importance of standing strong on our principles and our values. What's your response to what the Prime Minister said, Mr. Manley?
Well, he certainly dug himself in, didn't he? So I wouldn't want to be in Michael Kovrig's or Michael Spavor's shoes today. My view on this at the time was that there might be an opportunity. I don't see it as weakening the Canadian justice system. Exchanges of prisoners is commonplace. In fact, the Americans have just done so recently with Iran. So this doesn't compromise the justice system in any way, and it took, way back when this first occurred in 2018 in the fall. It took about 20 minutes on Google to see that there is discretion in the Extradition Act that rests with the Attorney General, and if in fact at the end of this whole legal proceeding the courts determine that Madame Meng should be committed for extradition, that is not the end of it. The Attorney General of Canada still has to exercise discretion to turn her over to the United States. So I get the argument that some have made about moral hazard. All of that is quite legitimate, and it needs to be considered carefully. But I don't get the notion that somehow or other this is against our justice system, our court system, or undermines the independence of the judiciary. Wrong test, wrong question.
So Minister Lametti, the Justice Minister, has said at that end point, once the court proceedings play out, yes, that is, he has a role then, he can intervene at that point, and that is something that he would consider. The argument that the Prime Minister put forth last week, and of course you weren't the only one who ended up calling for this, there was that letter of 19 other, pretty prominent Canadians, including Alan Rock and Louise Arbour, saying, actually, you should be intervening now and ending the extradition process. He said that was basically handing leverage over to China. And the argument he and others have made is, if you acquiesce here, you're basically giving them a green light to kidnap other Canadians in the future and play the same game. Do they have a point there?
We've watched China do this in the past. They did it with Garrett. They will do it in the future, regardless of what happens here. So I'm sorry to say that China has become an outlier in respect of how they deal with other nations' citizens. It's not just Canada, but we've had a number of experiences of it. And I don't think they're any more likely to do it as a result of this than they would have been anyway. It pains me to say that. But China has become a difficult case.
Sorry to interrupt. Should the fact that they do that, though, the fact that what you just laid out is true, not not inspire the Prime Minister to hesitate in the first case, though? The fact that this is the way that China conducts itself.
Well, you see, I wind this all back to the beginning because I think those two Canadians are in harm's way because the Canadian government didn't think carefully about whether this was a good use of the extradition law. I think it sticks out, even as the American request sticks out. Don't usually see extradition requests of senior executives in commercial cases. It's all linked to the Iran issue, which we don't agree with the Americans on. We're not parties to the nuclear non-proliferation agreement with Iran, but we supported it. And I think we should have politely but firmly declined to use the power of arrest in Meng's case. Because we did it, the response of China was almost predictable. And the way I look at it, Vashi, and I acknowledge there are lots of issues around this, but there are two Canadians that are perfectly innocent sitting in deplorable conditions because of the actions that the Canadian government took. And if it were my choice, I would make it a priority to get those two men their freedom. I don't know that such a deal could still be made.
On the extradition treaty, though, I mean, or on the decision of the Canadian government to arrest Meng Wanzhou based on that treaty, I mean, the argument again put forth by the Prime Minister, Minister Lametti, is this is a long-standing treaty, regardless of who the president is. And in fact, if the Canadian government had said, we are not going to comply with this treaty in this instance, there probably would have been big repercussions in the United States as well.
It's impossible to test that hypothesis because we did arrest her. But in the past, we have refused to exercise extradition in cases where we did not receive an assurance from the United States that the person being extradited would not be subject to capital punishment. We've done this kind of thing before. This is a particularly unusual case, I agree. But I feel deeply for those two Canadians. And, I had experiences with Canadians in custody in other countries when I was Minister of Foreign Affairs, and these are things that keep me awake at night because they're not in a Canadian prison. They're experiencing something that's probably pretty unpleasant for them.
Yeah, I think Mr. Kovrig's wife told us last week that he has not seen the outdoors the entire time he has been imprisoned, over 560 days.
It's horrific. Horrific and deplorable, and China deserves to be condemned for it. But I don't know what else we're able to do at this point. Rallying Australia and Norway to the cause is not going to move China's decision at all. And John Bolton can say what he likes. I'd like to see the evidence that the United States has lifted a finger to try to resolve this issue for us.
Well, maybe we'll see it in the interview tonight. I have to leave it there, unfortunately, Mr. Manley. I appreciate your time as always, though. Thank you so much.
Take care, Vashi.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.